Now, one of the best performing series on my channel is the Far Cry franchise, and I've actually managed to review every core game from 1 up to 6, with the addition of Primal, and it does seem like a lot of people are coming back to the games, or playing them for the first time now, but there's still one that I've put on the side, this being Far Cry New Dawn. Now, just like Primal, New Dawn isn't a main or core entry in the series, which is one of the main reasons why people don't really talk about the game much, even compared to Primal, because the thing is with that game is that it was a new concept and more of a standalone title, as we had a brand new world and the gameplay was completely stripped down to primal weapons that had never been done before. New Dawn, however, is basically a DLC for Far Cry 5, and it could have easily been that, especially with the game only being 11 hours in length. I say this because the story is a sequel to Far Cry 5, which I was happy with, as I actually really enjoyed that game. It's one of my favourite Far Cry games, and Joseph Seed was one of my favourite antagonists, and funny enough, he plays a big role in New Dawn. For me, he was the main villain of the game, even though it was really Mickey and Lou, who I'll talk more about in a bit. But this game basically concludes what happened after the ending of Far Cry 5, and more specifically Joseph's character. Now, if you haven't played the 5th game, I definitely recommend it, because this story would be very hard to understand if you didn't know the context. Though what I will say, if you do play New Dawn first, then you will be in for more of a surprise and a new style of gameplay and setting, whereas if you already played 5, then of course the sequel isn't going to offer something brand new to you and something totally different, which I already expected. The antagonists, Mickey and Lou, as I said, were quite forgettable, and it feels like you focus more on Joseph, who is a great villain anyway. That stands out a lot, so having him as a significant part of the game, it was already going to sort of overshadow the new antagonists, but with them being so basic and quite boring, it was inevitable. Whereas if they were really good, then it could have been a bit more balance between them both. Now, the story follows Far Cry 5, but set 17 years later, taking place in a more abandoned and run-down version of Hope County after it was bombed. Over time, it's of course become overgrown and derelict, but actually looks beautiful, and it still has a lot of vibrancy to it and colour, funny enough. And a very common colour scheme ran throughout the whole game's world and branding is pink and blue, with fields of pink flowers, pink and blue graffiti, cars, buildings, clothes and weapons. And I'm pretty sure the reason why all the wildflowers is because of a super bloom event, which is basically a burst of wildflowers and meadows after a rainy season. But naturally the game does follow this theme, which does make it quite unique and a really colourful game. Now Hope County is now starting to be rebuilt after so long, and various groups are now trying to take ownership of the land, a main one being the Highwaymen, which are a massive organisation taking over Hope County's island, with the two leaders being Mickey and Lou, which I think just serve as a role so they can just be a main character for this big group, because as I mentioned, they're quite basic and remind me so much of the Calypso twins from Borderlands 3, because they were just the same, following this typical villain you'd see in a kids TV show. And as highlighted, Joseph Seed is what makes this story, even though he was just carried over from 5, but we learn so much more about him because it's been so long, and he has sort of become a brand new character in himself, or at least such a different version to who we knew before. This troubled person who knows he's messed up, even though he may have been correct, as portrayed in Far Cry 5, where it did feel like he was right in a way, which is quite a common aspect in many of the Ubisoft villains, and New Dawn just solidifies Joseph and his actions. I think a big area letting Mickey and Lou down is just the fact that they don't have an awful lot to them, and the game being pretty much a DLC, it's quite hard to introduce a brand new villain who is going to really connect with the player. Even though we're given a bit of context, it wasn't enough with the type of game and story it is. Now the gameplay itself is going to feel quite like Far Cry. The weapons are pretty much all the same, but with cooler designs to them, as we're crafting most of them ourselves now, out of all the materials you find across the map, which is quite a pushed feature. You can get carried away with the amount of looting you can do even in the smallest locations you come across. The base raiding is of course a big feature in all the Far Cry games, and is where you'll gain the most loot and help build up your gameplay, like recruiting new specialists and gaining materials to upgrade not only your weapons as mentioned, but the home base and vehicles. In the home base you can pretty much do anything, and it's really nothing we haven't seen before. I mean, lots of Ubisoft games do have one central location to build your gameplay up, like in Ghost Recon for example, and the other Far Cry games. But I was quite surprised at how much crafting you can do in New Dawn, but I suppose it does sort of make sense because we're in this abandoned and post-apocalyptic version of the world where we now have to build everything up. But I'm aware some players may may not be a fan of this grind feeling to the gameplay. And other than the first craft of a weapon, there's nothing else you can add or tweak to it, so the customization is quite basic, which is weird because some entries go all out, and with this game you can only upgrade the levels, so the stats slightly increase like the damage, and that's basically it, adding on to the downside of a DLC-like game. And that brings me on to another sort of controversial area, which is the supernatural abilities, which are implemented into Far Cry New Dawn, and I do fall into this dislike. I mean, it depends on how far they go with it, but with the game it does allow you to unlock these magic abilities that Joseph Seed actually blesses, or I guess curses you with. And I think the whole reason for this is so that the protagonist can feel important and have a chosen role for them, to then, you know, make them have a purpose, because a part that I've yet to mention is the fact that the game follows a mute protagonist again, which I've come to expect from many Far Cry games. It just seems random at this point whether they'll have a talking one or not. Personally, I prefer a talking one as they feel more close to the player and just has a lot more to them, and it's something I keep coming back to in these Far Cry reviews, where if there is a mute protagonist, then the story relies so much on the side characters and the villains. This means some games do it well as the characters are great, but with Mickey and Lou being fairly basic, Joseph Seed is what carries the game, and because we've already seen him in 5, it's nothing overly exciting for the story and narrative, unfortunately. There's some cool weapons in the game alongside these supernatural abilities, with new special ones that follow the homemade wacky theme, not so much as Far Cry 6 with the Supremos, but there's still funny ones like a unicorn flamethrower and the saw launcher with some really detailed designs, like the scrap parts being used to make them, which is so highlighted in each one. I mean, this one has a bike handlebar coming out the side. As I said, it would have been nice if we could customize them a bit more, like attachments and different appearances, especially with the whole crafting system being so pushed in this game. You'd think we could. One area that the games, again, usually do quite well in, some more than others, is the stealth mechanics. The animations in takedowns are great in this game, with lots of different ones, all being quite brutal, and various ways to stealthily take an enemy down, like pulling them down from ledges, or a simple crouch walk behind, or a jump attack. They all feel quite smooth and fun to implement. This is of course when you can perform a stealth, because unfortunately the detection from enemies is almost instant, and this was an issue in Watch Dogs 2 and other titles, where it's just way too quick even on easy difficulty, so it almost strips away all the stealth gameplay. In Watch Dogs they do have the distractions and hacks to counter this, but in New Dawn there's just not an awful lot you can do, and even though I still did stealth, it's a shame that they took it down a bit. I mean, you can still take down enemies when they spot you of course, and in mid-battle, which was pretty fun to be honest. And that is where I end my 2024 review of Far Cry New Dawn. I'm glad I checked this game out after playing almost all the other games, but did keep my expectations lower due to the type of DLC game it is. And if you enjoy Far Cry 5 and want some extra content with gameplay, but also more context on what happened after the events of 5 with the story, then I do recommend the game if you're thinking about it. So if you did enjoy this video, then let me know by tapping that like button down below, and if you like single player and story driven games, then that's what this channel is all about. I have many reviews on a bunch of titles, with a playlist of a series I've done in the description down below. Lastly, if you'd like to support the channel by becoming a member at either level 1 or 2 to gain access to various perks, then click the join button, or there'll also be a link in the description. Thank you all for the support and watching until the very end. That was Far Cry New Dawn, and bye bye.